What if you're not stuck because you lack effort, but because you're observing from the same nervous system pattern? Most of us were taught that change requires force. Push harder, improve faster, control more. And when nothing shifts, we assume we are the problem. But in quantum physics, there's a strange discovery at the smallest scale. Particles don't behave as fixed objects. They behave as possibilities until they are measured. In physics, measurement is physical interaction, not belief. But the principle is provocative observation is not passive. It participates in outcome. Now consider this. Your brain is not recording reality. It is predicting and filtering it. Your nervous system is not neutral. It shapes what you notice, how you interpret, and what you act on. So maybe the real question isn't, how do I force reality to change? Maybe it's, from what state am I observing it? Because attention is never neutral. It selects, it organizes, it narrows possibility into experience. And once you understand that, change no longer begins with force. It begins with observation. Let's begin with a feeling we all know, the feeling of being stuck. It's that sense of running on a hamster wheel, putting in immense effort only to find yourself in the exact same spot, facing the exact same problems, day after day. Think of someone like Sarah, a talented graphic designer. For years, she was taught that life is a fixed, rigid structure. If she wanted something, a promotion, creative recognition, she had to apply force. She hustled, she grinded, she pushed. She made mile-long to-do lists, set ambitious goals, and stretched herself to the edge of exhaustion, believing that aggressive action was the only key. If a door was closed, she was told to knock harder. If a mountain stood in her way, she was told to climb faster. This is the paradigm of doing. And action, of course, is part of life. But when doing is fueled by tension, by the belief that reality must be wrestled into submission, it slowly shifts from empowerment to strain. Sarah worked longer hours than anyone else, trying to prove her value. Instead of feeling fulfilled, she felt overlooked and invisible. She tried to force her mind into positivity, battling every negative thought with rehearsed affirmations. But the more she fought her inner state, the louder it seemed to become. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't just working hard. Her nervous system was in constant threat mode, even when nothing dangerous was happening. When the body feels under pressure, perception narrows. The brain begins scanning for signs of danger, rejection, or failure. Neutral feedback feels personal. Minor setbacks feel catastrophic. The world starts to look like confirmation of the very fear you are trying to outrun. This is where burnout is born, not from action itself, but from action taken in a state of chronic internal contraction. The deeper belief beneath this pattern is rarely examined, the idea that reality is something separate from us, a solid, external structure that must be conquered, controlled, or overcome. In that model, life becomes a battlefield. Every obstacle feels like opposition. Every delay feels like resistance. But what if that entire premise is incomplete? What if reality is not a rigid machine, but a dynamic system of possibilities, one that interacts with how it is perceived? When Sarah believed the creative world was competitive and hostile, that belief shaped what she noticed. Her attention filtered for criticism, rivalry, scarcity. She wasn't imagining those things, but her awareness was tuned specifically to detect them. And attention is not neutral. It organizes experience. It highlights some signals and mutes others. So the more she observed struggle, the more struggle appeared central in her reality. Not because the universe was punishing her, but because her perceptual filter was locked onto a specific frequency. This is the subtle trap of forced change. When you try to force a new outcome without shifting the state from which you are observing, you amplify the very pattern you're trying to escape. More effort from anxiety creates more anxious perception. More striving from not enough reinforces the sense of lack. It feels like pushing against a wall that doesn't move. And eventually, exhaustion sets in. This is the moment most people double down. They assume they just haven't tried hard enough yet. So they apply more pressure. But what if the solution isn't a bigger sledgehammer? What if the shift begins somewhere much quieter? Not in how hard you act, but in how you observe. Before we can understand that fully, we need to step into the strange world where this idea first appeared not in self-help philosophy, but in quantum physics. To understand why observation matters, we have to go back to where this idea first unsettled science itself, not in a meditation hall, but in a laboratory. It begins with one of the most famous and perplexing experiments in modern physics, the double-slit experiment. Stay with me. We'll keep this simple. Imagine a solid wall with two narrow slits cut into it. Behind the wall is a detection screen. In front of it, a device fires tiny particles, think of them like microscopic grains of sand. If you fire ordinary particles through the slits, you'd expect them to behave predictably. The ones that pass through the left slit land behind the left opening. The ones that pass through the right slit land behind the right opening. On the screen, you see two distinct vertical lines. That's exactly what classical physics would predict. Now here's where things become strange. Scientists repeated the experiment using electrons, subatomic particles far smaller than atoms. And they fired them one at a time. If electrons were just tiny solid objects, you would expect the same two-line pattern. But that's not what happened. Instead of two lines, the screen displayed an interference pattern, a series of light and dark bands spread across the surface. The exact pattern you would expect if something behaved like a wave. Not a particle. It was as if each electron passed through both slits at once. As if it existed as a spread-out wave of possibility rather than a single point. In quantum mechanics, this is called superposition. Before measurement, the electron does not occupy one definite position. It exists as a probability wave, a mathematical description of all the possible places it could be. It is not yet here or there. It is potential. But then the physicists asked a simple question. Which slit is the electron actually going through? So they placed a tiny detector near the slits to measure the path. The moment they did that, the interference pattern disappeared. The electrons stopped behaving like waves. They behaved like particles again. Two clear lines appeared on the screen. In other words, the act of measurement changed the outcome. Now, this is important. In physics, observation does not mean a human being looking with their eyes. It means physical interaction, any measurement device interacting with the system. Collapse happens through interaction, not belief. But the implication remains extraordinary. At the most fundamental level, particles do not behave like fixed objects. They behave like fields of possibility until interaction narrows them into a definite state. This is known as the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. Before measurement probability, after measurement outcome, the world, at its smallest scale, is not a collection of solid things. It is a dynamic field of potentials that become specific through interaction. Physicists still debate what this truly means. There are multiple interpretations, Copenhagen. Many worlds. Pilot wave theory. No single philosophical explanation is universally accepted. But one thing is clear. Observation in the sense of interaction is not passive. It participates in what becomes real at the quantum level. And while we must be careful not to stretch physics beyond what it claims, this discovery opens a profound doorway. If at the foundation of matter itself there is a transition from possibility to actuality through interaction, what does that suggest about how systems behave more broadly? Before we answer that, we need to build a bridge carefully from particles to perception. Because the next step is not mystical, it's neurological. Now this is where we need to move carefully. In physics, the observer effect does not mean your thoughts rearrange atoms at will. Measurement is physical interaction. The collapse of a probability wave is not caused by belief. It is caused by contact. That distinction matters. But here is where the bridge becomes interesting. Because while quantum mechanics deals with particles, neuroscience deals with perception. And in neuroscience, something remarkably parallel is happening not at the level of electrons, but at the level of experience. Your brain does not passively record reality. It predicts it. Modern neuroscience increasingly supports what is called the predictive processing model. According to this model, your brain is not waiting for the world to tell it what is happening. It is constantly generating predictions about what it expects to perceive and then updating those predictions based on incoming sensory data. In other words, you are not seeing reality as it is. You are seeing reality as your brain predicts it to be. Sensory input is not the full picture. It is more like error correction. Your brain makes a guess first, then it adjusts. This means perception is not neutral. It is structured by expectation. Now let's bring in something more concrete. The Reticular Activating System, or RAS. The RAS is a network in your brainstem that acts as a filtering mechanism. Every second, your senses absorb millions of bits of information, sounds, colors, movements, subtle facial cues. If your brain processed all of it consciously, you would be overwhelmed. So the RAS decides what matters. And what does it use as criteria? Your beliefs, your goals, your fears, your expectations. Imagine you've been quietly considering leaving your corporate job to work independently. For months, that idea has lived only in the background of your mind. But the moment you seriously entertain it, something shifts. You suddenly notice articles about remote work. You overhear conversations about freelance opportunities. A friend mentions someone who just launched their own business. None of this information was newly created. It was already there. But now your filter has changed. If you believe people are critical, you will notice subtle signs of disapproval more quickly than signs of warmth. If you believe opportunities are scarce, you will detect obstacles faster than openings. The world did not shift. Your observation filter did. This is where the real bridge forms. At the quantum level, probability collapses into outcome through interaction. At the psychological level, possibility collapses into perception through attention. Your RAS and predictive brain act as your personal measurement device. They narrow a wide field of sensory possibility into a specific experienced reality before filtering countless stimuli. After filtering your version of the world. This does not mean you create matter with your mind, but it does mean you participate in the version of reality you experience. And here's why this matters so deeply. If your internal state is anxious, your predictive model tilts toward threat. Your RAS highlights uncertainty, criticism, potential rejection. The same environment that once felt neutral now feels hostile. If your nervous system is regulated and coherent, perception widens. You notice nuance. You detect opportunity. You interpret ambiguity differently. Reality feels different not because atoms rearranged, but because the interpretation layer changed. And interpretation guides action. Action shapes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce belief. Belief feeds the predictive model. This is a feedback loop. Now the observer effect becomes less mystical and more practical. Your observation is not bending physics. It is shaping perception. And perception determines what becomes actionable. If your perception is shaped by predictive patterns and attentional filters, then the question becomes practical. How do you work with that system consciously instead of being unconsciously driven by it? The first shift is learning to observe your internal state without immediately trying to correct it. Most people are not actually observing their thoughts. They are entangled in them. A thought appears, I'm falling behind, and within seconds, the body tightens, the breath shortens, and the mind begins constructing supporting evidence. The predictive brain does what it was designed to do. It looks for confirmation. The RAS highlights data that matches the fear. And before long, the thought feels like objective reality. Conscious observation interrupts this loop, not by suppressing the thought and not by arguing with it, but by stepping half a pace back internally. Instead of I am falling behind, the frame becomes, there is a thought that I am falling behind. That subtle linguistic shift matters. It separates the observer from the prediction. When that separation happens, the nervous system often softens slightly. Breath deepens. Muscles unclench. The body receives a different signal: we are not under immediate threat. And when the body shifts out of threat mode, perception widens. This is not mystical. It is biological. A regulated nervous system processes more nuance. It detects possibility where a stressed system detects danger. So the first pillar is non-judgmental awareness, not as a spiritual ideal, but as a regulatory mechanism. You observe without feeding the prediction with additional emotional charge. Over time, this reduces the automatic authority of old belief patterns. The second shift is intention, but intention held lightly. In the earlier model of force, intention is rigid. It demands a specific outcome on a specific timeline. It is often fueled by anxiety. But from the perspective of predictive processing, rigid intention can actually narrow perception too aggressively. When you fixate on one narrow outcome, you may filter out alternative paths that could meet the same deeper need. So instead of attaching to a specific external scenario, you clarify the underlying state you want to experience. Not I must get this exact promotion, but I want to feel creatively engaged and valued, not this relationship must work, but I want mutual respect and emotional safety. When intention is framed as a desired internal state rather than a fixed external script, the predictive brain updates differently. The RAS begins scanning for experiences aligned with that state, even if they arrive through unexpected channels. You are not forcing the field. You are recalibrating your filter. The third shift is noticing emergence without rushing to control it. When your internal state stabilizes and your intention becomes coherent rather than desperate, perception becomes sharper. You begin noticing subtle openings, a conversation worth following up on, an invitation that once seemed irrelevant. an idea that feels quietly aligned. In the past, those signals may have been filtered out because they did not match your stress-based prediction model. Now they register. This is often what people call synchronicity. From the inside, it feels like reality responding. From a psychological perspective, it is your perceptual system detecting patterns that were always present but previously ignored. Either way, the experience changes your sense of agency. You no longer feel like you are fighting the world. You feel like you are interacting with it. And interaction is different from force. When you shift from reacting unconsciously to observing consciously, you are not manipulating physics. You are altering the internal conditions that shape perception, interpretation, and behavior. Those three elements, perception, interpretation, behavior, quietly determine the trajectory of your life. Change the state from which you perceive, and you gradually change the choices you make. Change the choices you make, and over time, outcomes shift. The art of conscious observation is not dramatic. It is subtle. It does not require you to believe in supernatural influence. It requires you to recognize that awareness itself is active. The quality of attention you bring to experience regulates your nervous system, updates your predictive model, and reorients your filter. You are not trying to control reality. You are learning to participate in it with greater clarity. And that participation begins in the smallest possible place, the next thought you notice without immediately believing it. At this point, something subtle begins to rearrange itself in how you relate to change. Earlier, we examined the observer effect in physics. We saw that at the smallest scales. Systems do not behave as fixed objects, but as fields of probability that become definite through interaction. Then we crossed the bridge into neuroscience and discovered that your brain is also operating through prediction and filtering. Now the final step is not theoretical. It is experiential. When you repeatedly practice conscious observation, you are not just calming your thoughts. You are gradually updating the predictive model that shapes your world. Every time you notice a fear without identifying with it, you weaken its authority. Every time you regulate your nervous system instead of reacting automatically, you send new data into the loop. The brain registers this as a prediction error. It expected threat. Instead, it received safety. Over time, that mismatch forces revision. The model adjusts. And when the model adjusts, perception adjusts with it. The same conversation that once felt intimidating may now feel neutral. The same opportunity that once seemed unreachable may now feel worth exploring. Not because the external world transformed overnight, but because the lens through which you interpret it has shifted. This is where many people misunderstand the idea of hacking reality. They imagine bending events to their will. But what actually shifts first is identity. Not the abstract identity you describe in words, but the embodied identity encoded in posture, breath, tone of voice, and expectation. When your internal state changes, your behavior changes in micro ways: how long you hold eye contact, whether you follow up on a message, whether you interpret silence as rejection or simply as space. Those micro adjustments accumulate, and accumulation alters trajectory. Think of it less like collapsing a quantum wave and more like tuning an instrument. When an instrument is out of tune, even a well-written piece sounds tense. When it is tuned properly, harmony emerges naturally. You are not forcing harmony. You are creating the conditions for it. The observer you become determines the world you consistently perceive. An observer conditioned by chronic threat sees instability everywhere. An observer grounded in regulation sees complexity without immediate danger. One sees obstacles first, the other sees options. Over months and years, that difference compounds. This is not instant transformation. It is recalibration. And recalibration is powerful precisely because it is sustainable. When you stop fighting every internal fluctuation and begin observing it instead, you conserve enormous cognitive energy. That energy becomes available for clearer thinking, wiser decisions, and more aligned action. Your relationship with effort changes. Effort no longer feels like war. It feels like contribution. You still act, you still plan, you still work, but the action arises from coherence rather than contraction. And coherence has a different quality. It is steady. It is patient. It does not demand immediate proof. At the beginning of this video, we asked whether awareness might be more powerful than force. Now you can see why that question matters. Force attempts to dominate circumstances. Awareness reshapes the conditions from which you respond to them. You are not a passive witness drifting through a fixed world. Nor are you an all-powerful architect commanding atoms. You exist somewhere more nuanced and more interesting than either extreme. You are a participant. Your nervous system interacts with your environment. Your brain predicts and updates. Your attention filters and selects. Your interpretations guide action. Your actions influence outcomes. Outcomes feed back into belief. This is the loop. When you become conscious of it, you do not step outside reality. You step more fully into your role within it. And that role begins, always, in observation. Not observation as control. Observation as clarity. From that clarity, new trajectories quietly emerge.